June 1944, the Sabutu Passage. The American submarine USS Harder is caught on the surface. A Japanese destroyer, a warship built specifically to crush submarines, spots her and charges at high speed. Standard naval doctrine dictates one absolute response: dive deep immediately. Facing a heavily armed destroyer head-on is suicidal. But Commander Samuel Dealey does not order a dive. Instead, he orders his crew to hold their ground, pointing the submarine's bow directly at the attacking warship. As the enemy's massive steel hull rapidly closes the distance, one question remains. Why would a commander abandon every rule of survival? And what happens when that ultimate gamble is taken? This was not an isolated moment of madness. It was the defining tactic of Commander Samuel David Dealey during the USS Harder's legendary 5th Patrol. Over a span of just a few days, this single American submarine would execute a masterclass in aggressive naval warfare. Dealey systematically dismantled the Japanese fleet's vital defensive screen right before the monumental Battle of the Philippine Sea was about to erupt. He achieved this staggering disruption by perfecting a maneuver that terrified even veteran submariners: the down-the-throat torpedo shot. Instead of fleeing an attacking destroyer, the crew of the Harder would wait until the enemy vessel was bearing down on them at maximum speed, presenting only a razor-thin silhouette as a target. By firing torpedoes straight down the path of the charging warship, Dealey fundamentally inverted standard naval doctrine. He transformed the hunted submarine into the apex predator. But this extreme method required absolute nerves of steel and a borderline reckless disregard for the mathematical odds of survival. We are going to analyze the mechanics and the psychology of Dealey's uncompromising combat philosophy. How did the exact psychological trait that made him a brilliant tactical innovator fundamentally guarantee that he would eventually be trapped by his own methodology? To understand why a commander would consciously choose to play a deadly game of chicken with heavily armed warships, we must first look past the wartime propaganda and examine the desperate strategic reality the United States Navy was navigating in the Pacific in mid-1944. By the late spring of 1944, that strategic reality had reached a state of agonizing tension. The United States Navy was actively mobilizing for Operation Forager, the massive, unprecedented amphibious assault on the Marianas Islands. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, knew with absolute certainty that an invasion of this scale would force the Imperial Japanese Navy into a decisive, all-or-nothing confrontation. Across the Philippine Sea, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa was gathering the first mobile fleet, the concentrated bulk of Japan's remaining aircraft carriers, battleships, and heavy cruisers. But Ozawa was not massing his striking force in the open ocean or within the traditional, heavily defended bastions of the home islands. He chose to anchor his fleet at Tawi Tawi, a remote, rugged island cluster at the extreme southwestern edge of the Philippines, lying perilously close to the northeastern coast of Borneo. The selection of Tawi Tawi was dictated by strict logistical necessity, exposing a fatal weakness in the Japanese war machine. Japan's tanker fleet had been systematically decimated over the previous 2 years, and the unrefined, highly volatile crude oil extracted from nearby Tarakan was the only accessible fuel capable of keeping the Imperial Navy operational. But while tactically restrictive, Tawi Tawi was a natural fortress. The United States Pacific Fleet desperately needed intelligence. They needed to know the exact composition of Ozawa's forces, and more importantly, they required immediate, actionable warning the moment the mobile fleet slipped its moorings to contest the Marianas. To acquire that intelligence, American submarines had to penetrate the anchorage perimeter. The geographical reality of Tawi Tawi presented a nightmare scenario for submarine operations. The anchorage was shielded by a labyrinth of shallow straits, jagged coral reefs, and erratic, high-velocity tidal currents that could blindly push a submerged vessel dangerously off course, risking a fatal collision with the seafloor. For a submarine, deep water provides the ultimate armor. When enemy depth charges rain down, diving deep past the ocean's varying thermal layers allows a submarine to refract enemy sonar signals and escape the crushing underwater shock waves of high explosives. Around Tawi Tawi, there was no such sanctuary. The ocean floor rose sharply, boxing submarines into confined, brightly lit, shallow arenas, and Admiral Ozawa utilized this geography to his absolute advantage. To protect his heavy surface units, he surrounded the anchorage with a dense, highly active screen of veteran Japanese destroyers and anti-submarine patrols. These escorts were not the obsolete second-line vessels often assigned to standard merchant convoys. They were front-line warships, fast, heavily armed, equipped with active sonar, and crewed by men who had spent years hunting submarines across the Pacific. Their mandate was simple: keep the perimeter entirely clear of American periscopes by any means necessary, saturating the narrow approaches with depth charges at the slightest hint of a contact. To understand the immense pressure placed on the submarine captains tasked with breaching this perimeter, one must understand the crippling psychological and technological burden the American submarine force had carried since the beginning of the war. In the dark days of 1942 and early 1943, the United States submarine campaign had been severely hindered, not merely by the skill of the Japanese Navy, but by internal systemic failures. Many early submarine commanders were peacetime officers, drilled in an era where risking a highly expensive, multi-million-dollar submarine in aggressive combat was considered grounds for a court-martial. Their deeply ingrained instinct was extreme caution. Worse, those captains who did display tactical aggression were repeatedly betrayed by their own weapons. For nearly 2 years, American submarines went to sea equipped with the notoriously defective Mark 14 torpedo. Captains would routinely endure hours of grueling pursuit, expertly maneuver past escorts in hostile waters, position themselves for the mathematically perfect broadside shot, and fire, only to watch the torpedoes run 10 feet too deep and pass harmlessly under the target's keel. If the depth mechanism managed to function, the highly sensitive, over-engineered magnetic exploder often detonated the warhead prematurely in the ship's wake, alerting the enemy without inflicting any structural damage. And if a captain disabled the magnetic exploder and relied purely on contact, the firing pin mechanism was fundamentally flawed. It was found to physically crush itself on impact during a perfect 90-degree hit, resulting in a dull metallic thud against the enemy's hull instead of a catastrophic explosion. These systemic, institutional failures bred a culture of intense frustration and strictly defensive tactical thinking. The prevailing doctrine of the time dictated a rigid hierarchy of targets. Sink the slow, unarmored merchant maroos carrying troops and raw materials, and actively evade the heavily armed destroyers. A destroyer was a hazard to be avoided at all costs, never a target to be actively hunted. Engaging a dedicated anti-submarine escort deliberately was viewed as an unacceptable risk, offering zero strategic payoff. But by mid-1944, that paradigm had violently shifted. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, the aggressive commander of the Pacific Fleet Submarine Force, had ruthlessly purged the overly cautious peacetime captains from the ranks, replacing them with a new breed of battle-tested, highly aggressive officers. Furthermore, the agonizing mechanical flaws of the Mark 14 torpedo had finally been identified and largely resolved through relentless, unauthorized field testing. The weapons now functioned as designed. But with functional weapons came an immense, crushing tactical burden. There were no longer any valid excuses for returning to port with unused torpedoes. The strategic demand placed on the Pacific Fleet submarines rapidly evolved from simple commerce raiding to direct active attrition of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combat power. To effectively blind Admiral Ozawa's fleet at Tawi Tawi, American submarines could no longer just sneak past the outer defensive screens to count the battleships. They were now explicitly ordered to systematically eliminate the eyes and the shields of the Japanese Navy. They had to hunt the hunters. This new directive created a profound life-or-death psychological conflict for the submarine commanders patrolling the Sulu archipelago. The fundamental architecture and physics of a World War II submarine made it a weapon of stealth, highly vulnerable while operating on the surface, and agonizingly slow when submerged. A destroyer, by stark contrast, was a purpose-built predator, capable of racing at over 30 knots, armed with patterns of depth charges mathematically designed to crush a pressure hull like a tin can. The natural evolutionary instinct for survival demanded that a submarine slip quietly away into the depths the moment an escort's active sonar ping echoed through the steel hull. To fulfill the new strategic imperative, a captain had to actively repress every ingrained survival instinct taught at the Naval Academy. He had to deliberately attract the attention of a warship designed specifically to kill him. He had to sit in shallow, treacherous water, knowing he had no deep thermal layers to hide in, and invite a high-speed, head-on attack from a veteran Japanese destroyer crew. This was not merely a minor tactical adjustment. It was a fundamental inversion of naval warfare. The transition from cautious evasion to the active, predatory hunting of warships required a complete psychological reprogramming. It required a shattering of established rules and an embrace of extreme, calculated risk where the margin for error was measured in seconds. That absolute breaking point, the definitive moment where traditional survival doctrine was abandoned in favor of aggressive, unprecedented confrontation, occurred in the treacherous, swirling waters around Tawi Tawi on the morning of June 6, 1944. As the sun rose over the treacherous currents of the Sabutu Passage on that morning, Commander Samuel Dealey and the USS Harder were positioned exactly where survival was statistically least likely, directly inside the heavily defended perimeter of the Japanese anchorage. Their presence was quickly detected. Cutting through the swells, the Japanese destroyer Minizuki locked on to the American submarine. The reaction of the Japanese commander was immediate and aggressive. The warship accelerated to flank speed, its bow swinging sharply to point directly at the Harder. In naval warfare, a charging destroyer is a submarine crew's ultimate nightmare. Coming in bow first, the vessel presents a razor-thin silhouette, essentially eliminating the possibility of a standard broadside torpedo shot. The closure rate is terrifying. At combat speed, a destroyer can cover 1,000 yards in roughly 60 seconds. The deeply ingrained response of any American submarine crew in this scenario was to crash dive immediately, desperately seeking depth to evade the inevitable barrage of depth charges. Inside the Harder's conning tower, the crew braced for the dive alarm. It never sounded. Instead, Dealey issued a command that defied conventional survival doctrine. He ordered his helmsmen to hold their ground, keeping the Harder's bow pointed straight back at the attacking warship. The psychological strain of this decision was immense. The crew was forced to sit in agonizing tension, trusting a commander who appeared to be committing them to a suicidal game of chicken. Through the periscope, Dealey watched the Minizuki rapidly expand in his optics, its bow wave rising violently as the heavy ship surged forward. The mechanics of the down-the-throat shot dictated that it was a gamble with absolutely zero margin for error. If Dealey launched his torpedoes too early, the Japanese lookouts would spot the white wakes churning toward them, giving the agile destroyer ample time to turn and evade the spread. But if he waited too long, the torpedoes would lack the physical distance required to arm their warheads in the water. Worse, the sheer physical momentum of the rushing warship would carry its hull directly over the Harder, crushing the submarine's pressure hull upon impact. Dealey had to hold his nerve, calculating the exact mathematical intersection of speed, distance, and human reaction time. The range plummeted 3,000 yards, 2,000 yards. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of the Minizuki's high-speed screws grew deafening, reverberating audibly through the cold steel hull of the American submarine. 1,500 yards. The tension in the cramped conning tower was suffocating, yet Dealey remained frozen at the optics, deliberately delaying the launch. Finally, as the destroyer closed to a painfully intimate distance of under 1,100 yards, Dealey issued the order to fire. A spread of torpedoes blasted from the Harder's forward tubes, racing straight down the throat of the charging warship. Because both vessels were hurtling directly toward each other, the impact occurred in mere seconds. The Minizuki had no chance to maneuver. The torpedoes slammed into the destroyer, detonating with catastrophic force. A massive explosion obliterated the forward section of the warship, sending a violent shockwave through the water that physically rocked the Harder. In an instant, the 30-knot Predator was reduced to a shattered, sinking ruin. This single, violent confrontation was a critical turning point. It unequivocally proved that an American submarine could successfully duel a dedicated, heavily armed escort head-on on the surface, provided the commander possessed absolute, nerve-shredding timing. But the true impact of this encounter lay in what followed. Dealey had validated a desperate tactical concept. Now, he was about to transform it into a relentless, systematic campaign of psychological warfare against the Japanese fleet. Dealey did not retreat into the deep ocean to celebrate the sinking of the Minizuki. The destruction of a fleet destroyer was a monumental achievement for any submarine crew, an event that usually marked the climax of a patrol and prompted a quiet, cautious withdrawal to safer, less congested waters. But withdrawing would violate the core of Dealey's strategic objective. He was not there to score a single, isolated victory. He was there to systematically dismantle the defensive perimeter of the Japanese First Mobile Fleet. To accomplish that, the USS Harder had to remain inside the killing zone. The Sabutu Passage was a highly hostile environment that actively fought against submerged submarine operations. The tidal currents ripping through the narrow straits between Borneo and the Sulu archipelago were incredibly powerful, often exceeding 5 knots. A fleet submarine, submerged at periscope depth, attempting to maintain a silent patrol speed of 2 or 3 knots, could easily find itself being physically pushed backward or dragged dangerously close to jagged, uncharted coral reefs. Navigating this underwater labyrinth required the crew to maintain a constant, exhausting state of high alert. Inside the pressure hull, the physical conditions were brutal. Because the Harder was forced to remain submerged during the long daylight hours to avoid the relentless Japanese air patrols circling the anchorage at Tawi Tawi, the internal temperature of the submarine rapidly climbed. In the tropical waters of the Philippine Sea, the heat inside the steel tube routinely exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The air conditioning systems struggled under the load and frequently failed, leaving the steel bulkheads slick with heavy condensation that dripped onto electrical panels and pooled on the deck plates. The 80 men aboard breathed recycled air heavy with the sharp stench of diesel oil, battery acid, and unwashed bodies. Carbon dioxide levels slowly crept upward as the hours ticked by, causing severe headaches, fatigue, and sluggish reaction times. Yet, despite the physical degradation of his crew, Dealey kept the Harder hovering just below the surface, perfectly positioned across the primary transit lanes used by Admiral Ozawa's screening forces. He was actively waiting for the enemy to come looking for him. He did not have to wait long. Less than 24 hours after the Minizuki went to the bottom, the ocean surface above the Harder was churning with the high-speed screws of a furious Japanese search and destroy element. On the morning of June 7th, the sound operator aboard the American submarine detected the rhythmic, rapid-beat acoustic signature of approaching warships. Dealey raised the periscope for a fleeting observation, exposing the attack optic for no more than a few seconds to avoid detection by enemy surface radar. Through the ocean spray, he identified a primary target, the Japanese destroyer Hayanami. The Hayanami was a Yugumo-class destroyer, representing one of the most advanced and lethal anti-submarine vessels in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Displacing over 2,000 tons and capable of 35 knots, it was heavily armed with depth-charge throwers and equipped with Type 93 active sonar. The warship was systematically sweeping the passage, attempting to locate and crush the submarine responsible for the previous day's ambush. Standard operating procedure for a fleet boat encountering a Yugumo-class destroyer on an active hunt was immediate, silent evasion. Dealey, however, ordered the crew to battle stations and began maneuvering the Harder directly into the destroyer's operational path. The mechanics of executing an attack against an actively searching destroyer require a level of mathematical precision that borders on the impossible under combat stress. In the confined space of the conning tower, the attack party gathered around the torpedo data computer, an early electromechanical analog computer essential for calculating a firing solution. The TDC required constant, highly accurate inputs: the target's exact bearing, its estimated range, its speed, and its angle on the bow. It combined these variables with the submarine's own course and speed to generate a precise gyro angle for the torpedoes. If any of these human estimations were off by even a fraction of a degree, or a single knot of speed, the torpedoes would miss wide, and the submarine would instantly reveal its exact position to a highly motivated killer. Dealey provided the data points through rapid, perilous periscope observations. Each time the steel tube broke the surface, it risked creating a feather of white water that Japanese lookouts, scanning the ocean with high-powered binoculars, were specifically trained to spot. As the Hayanami closed the distance, performing erratic, zigzag maneuvers to avoid the very ambush Dealey was setting, the psychological pressure inside the Harder reached a breaking point. The crew could hear the distinct, piercing ping of the Japanese active sonar sweeping through the water, physically vibrating against their own steel hull. It was the sound of an enemy searching for them in the dark. Dealey held his fire, allowing the destroyer to close to an aggressively short range. He needed the Hayanami to commit to a specific heading. When the warship turned, presenting a viable target angle, Dealey ordered the firing sequence. A spread of Mark 14 torpedoes surged from the forward tubes. Unlike the defective, highly unreliable weapons that had plagued the Pacific Fleet in 1942, these torpedoes ran perfectly true. They struck the Hayanami amidships. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The torpedoes likely penetrated the destroyer's main magazines, triggering a massive secondary detonation that violently severed the warship in two. Through the periscope, Dealey watched the Hayanami disintegrate and slip beneath the surface in less than a minute. But the destruction of the target was only the beginning of the ordeal. The Hayanami was not alone. It was operating as part of a coordinated hunter-killer group. Instantly, the surviving Japanese escorts converged on the torpedo wakes, dropping heavy patterns of depth charges. Dealey ordered the Harder deep, but the shallow bottom of the Sabutu passage offered minimal vertical sanctuary. A fleet submarine's pressure hull was rated for a specific crush depth, and surviving a depth charge attack relied entirely on putting enough water between the submarine and the hydrostatic fuses of the explosives. Here, there was no room to hide. The submarine was subjected to a brutal, bone-jarring pounding. High explosives detonated in the water column, sending massive hydraulic shock waves slamming into the hull. Light bulbs shattered, cork insulation snowed down from the overheads, and the deck plates heaved violently under the men's feet. The crew operated in near total silence, communicating solely via hand signals, knowing that a dropped wrench or a loud voice could be picked up by the hydrophones of the destroyers circling angrily directly above them. Through masterful maneuvering and a deep, intuitive understanding of the chaotic tidal currents, Dealey managed to slip the Harder out of the immediate search grid, leaving a second frontline Japanese destroyer at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. To fully understand the strategic magnitude of what was happening, the narrative must shift to the headquarters of Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa and Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita at Tawi Tawi. The Imperial Japanese Navy High Command was suddenly facing a localized crisis that completely defied their operational logic. Tawi Tawi had been selected specifically because it was considered an impenetrable fortress, shielded by complex geography and guarded by an elite screen of veteran warships. It was supposed to be the ultimate safe harbor where the first mobile fleet could finalize its preparations for the total annihilation of the American forces at the Marianas. Now, that fortress was bleeding heavily. The sudden, inexplicable loss of the Minizuki and the Hayanami in less than 48 hours sent shockwaves through the Japanese intelligence apparatus. It was not merely the loss of the ships that alarmed the High Command. It was the unprecedented method of their destruction. Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, developed through years of naval tradition and combat experience, operated on a rigid psychological profile of the enemy. They viewed the submarine strictly as a weapon of opportunity, utilized by inherently cautious commanders who would strike at slow, unarmored merchant vessels and immediately flee at the first sign of an armed escort. A submarine was expected to act as prey when confronted by a predator. The events unfolding in the Sabutu passage were violently contradicting this established doctrine. American submarines were no longer evading the defensive screen. They were actively, aggressively hunting the screen itself. Japanese communications networks crackled with urgent, highly confused traffic. Intercepted reports detailed destroyers being struck with mathematical precision while actively engaged in aggressive anti-submarine sweeps. The Japanese commanders struggled to comprehend the tactical shift. They could not fathom that a single American submarine commander would possess the sheer audacity to repeatedly challenge fully armed hunter-killer groups in confined, shallow waters without the element of surprise. The immediate conclusion drawn by Japanese intelligence was not that they were facing one brilliant, borderline reckless captain. Instead, their strategic models dictated that such a high concentration of successful, devastating attacks against heavily defended combatants could only be the result of a massive, highly coordinated American offensive. This critical miscalculation by the Japanese High Command was permanently cemented just 2 days later on June 9th. Despite enduring a punishing depth-charge barrage, Commander Dealey flatly refused to abandon his patrol sector. The Harder remained deeply embedded inside the Tawi Tawi perimeter, a solitary predator operating in an ocean that was now swarming with highly alerted, vengeful Japanese naval and air forces. The surface of the Sabutu Passage was saturated with Japanese search planes, dropping sonobuoys and scanning for the slightest shadow beneath the waves. Multiple destroyer divisions were actively sweeping the straits, executing overlapping active sonar patterns designed to box in and trap any submerged vessel. In this hyper-lethal environment, mere survival was an extraordinary feat of seamanship. But Dealey was not focused on survival. His sole focus remained attrition. Late in the evening of June 9th, the Harder's radar and sonar operators picked up multiple new contacts. Dealey carefully maneuvered the submarine to periscope depth under the cover of darkness. He identified 2 more Japanese destroyers, sweeping the passage in a coordinated line-abreast formation. One of these vessels was the Tanikaze, a highly decorated veteran Kagero-class destroyer that had survived the catastrophic Battle of Midway and numerous grueling campaigns in the Solomon Islands. It was a seasoned ship with a highly experienced crew actively searching for the American submarine that was bleeding the mobile fleet dry. Dealey found himself in a remarkably similar tactical geometry to his previous engagements. The destroyers were approaching rapidly, their acoustic profiles filling the Harder's sound gear. Once again, Dealey actively suppressed the primal urge to dive and run. He opted to execute an aggressive night surface or shallow submerged attack, using the darkness and the heavy sea state to mask his periscope feather. The primary target was the Tanikaze. The mechanics of this specific engagement were perhaps the most dangerous yet. Because the destroyers were operating in close tandem, firing on one immediately exposed the submarine to the other at point-blank range. Dealey carefully tracked the Tanikaze, feeding the target's speed and bearing into the torpedo data computer, while the enemy ships bore down on him. As the range dropped below 2,000 yards, the tension inside the submarine was absolute. The crew awaited the firing order in the sweltering heat, fully aware that a miss or premature detonation would result in an immediate dual-ship depth charge run that they were statistically unlikely to survive. Dealey fired a spread of 4 torpedoes straight into the path of the advancing warships. The mathematical calculation was flawless. 2 of the heavy Mark 14 torpedoes slammed directly into the hull of the Tanikaze. The massive explosions tore through the destroyer's thin outer armor, rupturing fuel bunkers and detonating internal munitions. The veteran warship, which had survived the absolute worst of the Pacific War for 3 years, rolled over and sank rapidly into the dark waters of the Sabutu Passage. Instantly, the second Japanese destroyer charged down the illuminated torpedo bearing, dropping a heavy string of depth charges right on top of the Harder's position. Dealey was forced to take the submarine into a steep, highly evasive dive, twisting blindly through the unpredictable ocean currents as the water erupted around them. The submarine was violently shaken, taking minor structural damage as the concussive shock waves hammered the steel hull. But Dealey once again successfully maneuvered his boat out of the kill zone. In a span of just 4 days, a single American submarine had engaged and utterly destroyed 3 elite, heavily armed Japanese fleet destroyers directly outside the anchorage of the first mobile fleet. The sinking of the Tanikaze permanently broke the operational confidence of the Imperial Japanese Navy at Tawi Tawi. When the reports of this third catastrophic loss reached Admiral Ozawa, the situation rapidly escalated from tactical concern to outright strategic panic. The fog of war, the inherent uncertainty and lack of clear information in combat, acted as a massive force multiplier for the USS Harder. Japanese intelligence officers, looking at a map of the Sabutu Passage, saw 3 red marks where 3 frontline warships had been annihilated in a matter of hours. Analyzing the ferocity, the frequency, and the sheer audacity of the attacks, they reached a fatal, highly erroneous conclusion. They officially reported to the High Command that the Tawi Tawi anchorage was entirely surrounded by a massive, highly coordinated American wolf pack. They estimated that perhaps half a dozen or more fleet submarines had successfully infiltrated the defensive perimeter and were systematically preparing to slaughter the heavy cruisers and aircraft carriers anchored within. This phantom wolf pack created an unbearable logistical and tactical paradox for Admiral Ozawa. His massive fleet was already suffering from a critical, paralyzing fuel shortage. Because the Japanese tanker fleet had been decimated by earlier submarine campaigns, Ozawa's ships were forced to burn unrefined Terracan crude oil pumped directly from nearby Borneo. This raw petroleum was highly volatile and extremely rich in sulfur. It actively ate away at the delicate boiler tubes of the warships, causing severe mechanical degradation even when the fleet was sitting perfectly idle. But the fleet could no longer sit idle. The terrified reports of a massive American submarine concentration forced Ozawa to order his heavy units, his irreplaceable battleships and fleet carriers, to conduct constant, high-speed, evasive maneuvers within the tight confines of the anchorage, just to avoid becoming static targets. These frantic maneuvers burned vast quantities of the precious, highly combustible, unrefined crude oil. Furthermore, his destroyer screen, the very vessels desperately needed to escort his aircraft carriers into the upcoming decisive battle, was being systematically erased by an enemy they could not reliably track or destroy. Ozawa realized that if he remained at Tawi Tawi, his fleet would either be bled to death by submarines or rendered entirely immobile by a lack of fuel before the battle for the Marianas even began. The illusion of overwhelming American force, meticulously manufactured by the hyper-aggressive actions of Samuel Dealey and a single exhausted submarine crew, forced Admiral Ozawa into a catastrophic strategic compromise. He could no longer wait for his complex logistical train to fully organize, nor could he properly coordinate his massive surface fleet with land-based air forces as original operational doctrine demanded. Believing his primary strike force was in imminent danger of being torpedoed at anchor, Ozawa ordered the first mobile fleet to prematurely weigh anchor and abandon the Tawi Tawi fortress. On June 13, 1944, the massive Japanese armada steamed out of the anchorage, days ahead of schedule and severely off balance, heading directly toward the Philippine Sea. This forced early departure directly disrupted the highly synchronized Japanese timetable for Operation AGO. By forcing the Japanese fleet into the open ocean prematurely, Dealey fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of the Pacific War, severely degrading Japanese readiness and setting the stage for the crushing defeat they would soon suffer. Commander Samuel Dealey and the USS Harder eventually returned to base in Fremantle, Australia, having completed what is widely considered the most brilliant and devastatingly effective submarine patrol of the Second World War. Dealey was elevated to a living legend, awarded the Medal of Honor, the United States military's highest decoration for valor. He had single-handedly validated the controversial doctrine of extreme aggression, proving definitively that a submarine could actively hunt and destroy its natural predators. However, this monumental triumph seeded a highly dangerous institutional blindness within the American submarine command. The Pacific Fleet celebrated the extraordinary results without fully confronting the terrifying mathematical reality of the methodology. Dealey had succeeded through a rare combination of absolute tactical brilliance, an iron-willed crew, and a razor-thin margin of pure luck. He had effectively played Russian roulette with the Imperial Japanese Navy and walked away. But the narrative quickly solidified within the submarine force that this level of extreme, uncompromising aggression was the new standard, rather than a statistical anomaly. The deadly lesson taken from the 5th Patrol of the USS Harder was that aggressive confrontation always prevails, a conclusion that entirely ignored the sheer, terrifying risk involved in the down-the-throat shot. It was a psychological trap that Dealey himself had helped construct. He had proven beyond a doubt that he could outduel any escort on the ocean. But this unwavering belief in aggressive invincibility meant that in the future, when faced with overwhelming odds, the option to dive, evade, and survive would no longer be considered. The towering legend of the Harder dictated that the only acceptable direction was forward, directly into the guns of the enemy, creating a tactical philosophy that practically guaranteed the commander would eventually place his submarine in a situation from which neither brilliance nor luck could ever extract them. The institutional adulation surrounding the USS Harder acted as a powerful accelerant to an already dangerous mindset. Dealey was no longer just a submarine commander, he was the primary architect of a new, hyper-aggressive doctrine. When he prepared for his 6th War Patrol in August 1944, he carried the immense, unspoken pressure of his own myth. Submarine Command expected him to replicate the tactical slaughter of the Sabutu passage, but the fundamental flaw in the down-the-throat philosophy was its reliance on a completely static enemy. It assumed the Imperial Japanese Navy would continually react with predictable, blind aggression, charging in straight lines and falling victim to the exact same ambush. But the Japanese were not static. The catastrophic loss of elite destroyers around Tawi Tawi had triggered a rapid, brutal evolution in their anti-submarine warfare operations. Japanese naval intelligence meticulously analyzed the sinkings of ships like the Minizuki and the Hayanami. They recognized the lethal pattern. They understood that elite American submarines were deliberately holding their ground at shallow depths, waiting to invite the high-speed, head-on charge. To counter this, the Japanese fundamentally altered their screening behavior. they increasingly deployed a new generation of specialized escort vessels known as kaibokan, or coastal defense ships. While not as fast as fleet destroyers, these subchasers were highly maneuverable, deeply specialized, and armed with upgraded sonar and heavy depth charge throwers. More importantly, Japanese escort commanders were now explicitly trained to anticipate the frontal torpedo spread. Instead of executing a predictable, straight-line attack, these vessels were instructed to employ erratic, aggressive zigzag patterns as they closed the distance, constantly shifting their angle on the bow to ruin the American targeting geometry. They also began operating in tightly coordinated hunter-killer pairs. The doctrine was simple. If a submarine revealed its position by firing down the throat of one attacking vessel, the second ship would immediately flank the periscope feather and lay down a devastating pattern of explosives. This tactical adaptation violently inverted the mathematical probabilities of survival. The success of Dealey's signature maneuver had always required the enemy to commit to a singular trajectory and to be paralyzed by the shock of a sudden counterattack. By August 1944, that shock value was gone. The element of surprise had evaporated. Dealey, however, remained absolutely committed to his aggressive methodology. When the USS Harder departed for the coast of Luzon, her commander was bringing a tactic optimized for June into a combat environment that had completely adapted by August. The statistical probability of surviving repeated point-blank duels against heavily armed escorts who were actively baiting that exact maneuver was rapidly approaching zero. The disconnect was profound. A legendary commander, locked into an uncompromising doctrine of pure aggression, was steering his boat directly toward an enemy that had spent the last 2 months learning exactly how to kill him. The inevitable collision was now just days away off the western shores of the Philippines. That fatal collision occurred on the morning of August 24, 1944. The Harder was operating in a coordinated wolf pack off the coast of Luzon, navigating the shallow, congested waters of Dealey Bay. Dealey was maneuvering in tandem with another American submarine, the USS Harder. The tactical situation rapidly deteriorated when the Wolfpack detected a heavily escorted Japanese convoy. The Harder, having exhausted its torpedo supply in a previous engagement, was highly vulnerable on the surface. Dealey, adhering strictly to his philosophy of extreme aggression and absolute loyalty to his fellow submariners, deliberately positioned the Harder to draw the enemy's fire, acting as a shield to allow the Harder to escape. The Japanese response was immediate and calculated. 2 specialized coastal defense vessels detached from the convoy screen and aggressively charged the Harder's position. One of these vessels was the CD-22, a highly maneuverable subchaser crewed by veterans who had been specifically briefed on the lethal American tactics utilized at Tawi Tawi. As the Japanese warships accelerated, their active sonar pinging sharply through the water, Dealey executed the exact sequence that had made him a legend. He did not order a deep dive. He held the submarine at periscope depth, pointing the bow directly at the approaching CD-22, inviting the high-speed charge. Inside the Harder's conning tower, the attack party rapidly fed the targeting data into the computer. The range closed terrifyingly fast. Dealey waited until the Japanese vessel was at point-blank distance, ensuring maximum lethality before issuing the order to fire. A spread of torpedoes erupted from the forward tubes, streaking straight toward the bow of the CD-22. But this time, the enemy did not freeze in shock. The Japanese commander of the CD-22 had anticipated the exact maneuver. As soon as the torpedo wakes were spotted churning through the water, the Japanese captain executed a violent, perfectly timed, evasive turn. The coastal defense ship leaned heavily, cutting sharply across the water, deliberately altering its targeting geometry at the last possible second. The heavy American torpedoes slashed harmlessly past the hull of the CD-22, disappearing into the vastness of the Pacific. Dealey's signature maneuver, the mathematical gamble he had won so many times before, had finally failed. The counterstrike was instantaneous. Before Dealey could retract the periscope and order an emergency dive, the CD-22, maintaining its aggressive momentum, surged directly over the Harder's position. The Japanese crew unleashed a massive, concentrated barrage of depth charges right down the visible torpedo wake. The explosives sank rapidly, detonating in a tight, devastating pattern directly above the shallow, submerged American submarine. The concussive force of the high explosives in the shallow water of Dassel Bay was catastrophic. The shock waves violently crushed the Harder's pressure hull, instantly breaching the watertight compartments. There was no prolonged struggle, no desperate evasion. In a matter of seconds, the USS Harder, the most feared American submarine in the Pacific Fleet, was driven violently to the ocean floor, permanently entombing Commander Samuel Dealey and his entire crew of 79 men. The destruction of the Harder was not the result of bad luck or a mechanical failure. It was the brutal, inevitable realization of the exact mathematical margin of error that Dealey had spent months consciously defying. The extreme aggression that had decimated the Japanese screen at Tawi Tawi had finally encountered an enemy prepared to exploit its single fatal flaw. The loss was absolute, immediately silencing the legendary boat and leaving a heavy, unresolved legacy buried beneath the waters of the South China Sea for decades. For exactly 80 years, the violent conclusion of that August morning remained shrouded in the dark, inaccessible depths off the coast of Luzon. But the ocean does not operate on human timelines. In the spring of 2024, an advanced marine robotics expedition, mapping the seafloor of the South China Sea, detected a massive, distinct acoustic anomaly at a depth of 3,000 feet. When the tethered submersibles descended into the freezing, lightless abyss, their high-definition cameras illuminated a chilling sight. Resting upright on its keel, perfectly preserved in the frigid water, was the remarkably intact steel hull of the USS Harder. The footage transmitted back to the surface was haunting in its stillness. The ocean did not dramatically return the bones of the 80 men lost that day. It merely revealed the silent, rusting shell of their final moments. The mangled metal near the conning tower stands as the only physical evidence of the catastrophic violence that ended the patrol in seconds. This frozen wreckage is not just a grave. It is a stark, enduring monument to the absolute, unforgiving reality of technological warfare. It strips away the wartime propaganda and the romanticized myths of naval combat, leaving only a cold steel tube where 79 men were instantly crushed by hydrostatic pressure. When analyzing the legacy of Commander Samuel Dealey, the wreckage at 3,000 feet forces a profound reckoning with the nature of military command. Dealey's methodology proved unequivocally that extreme, uncompromising tactical aggression can temporarily shatter the strategic balance of a naval theater. By turning a hunted submarine into a predator, he disrupted the Imperial Japanese Navy's timetable and yielded incredible, almost impossible victories. But the silent hull of the Harder proves the permanent cost of that success. It demands a psychological commitment to risk that eventually becomes a trap. Once a commander hardwires his crew and his own psyche to accept a zero margin of error gamble, the ability to step back, to dive, to evade, to survive when the tactical environment inevitably changes, is lost. The aggression that makes a commander a legend is often the exact same mechanism that guarantees he will eventually be destroyed by an enemy that learns how to counter it. Commander Samuel Dealey rewrote the established rules of submarine warfare by consciously choosing to hunt the hunters, transforming a highly vulnerable vessel into an apex predator that temporarily broke the operational spine of the Japanese fleet. He achieved the impossible by living exclusively within the razor-thin margin of a point-blank torpedo launch, betting the lives of his crew on his own unwavering nerve and the sheer shock of a frontal assault. But a towering military legend built upon a high-speed game of lethal chicken carries an inescapable expiry date. In the cold, unforgiving mathematics of the Pacific War, Extreme tactical aggression can secure monumental operational victories, but the laws of probability are absolute, and eventually the ocean always collects its due.